You're listening to Rainbow Radio. This is In My Humble Opinion. I'm your host, Nice Guy Eddie. With me tonight is Bria, the artist and author behind Life of Bria Comics. Bria, it's great to see you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm a big fan of your comic. I've been catching up upon it recently. I want to say one thing. You and I are kindred spirits in one way. I have never met somebody else for whom dinosaurs is such an important thing.
Oh, that makes me really happy. I don't know. I think everybody likes dinosaurs to some degree, but when you meet like a dinosaur person, it's like, I see you.
We also seem to like a lot of the same movies too, because you make a lot, especially the early comic strips, make a lot of references to, well, just a lot of movies. But it's just, I almost feel like Captain America and the Avengers when I'm like, hey, I get that one. Yeah. There's another one. Good reference.
It's quite a thing to be like, you've got a certain frame of reference for your whatever your culture may be, and like sometimes it can be alienating if it's like, I only like this specific weird thing. But when you find, again, like just like dinosaur people, you find your people, it's like, no, I'm not out of touch. It's the children who are wrong.
Exactly. Oh my God, so much of that these days. More as time goes on, right? So for those who haven't read it, tell us a little bit about the comic, what it's all about.
Well, I mean, it's really evolved over the years. Like I think a lot of what you referenced just there, the early years, they started in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
I'd actually just started transition, and I'd moved back home from living in Thailand for about a year, where I was working as an art teacher. And I'd gone to art school and I'd done some comics, a little bit of published work, and I just didn't really know what to do with my life. I was basically starting over fresh, right? New me, new everything kind of thing. And I just, like, on the recommendation of a family friend who was also an artist, I decided to rent a cheap studio space in Vancouver's Chinatown, basically like the cheapest you could find, and just went in every day to start something. I just started drawing, and I eventually, this comic kind of evolved out of it. I realized, like, well, I've been trying to do comics, but to do like a big graphic novel, like what I really was trying to do before that, that's a little intimidating right now. What if I just do some small thing, a little comic that I do basically every day to get me in the habit of drawing and producing, and eventually something coming out of it that maybe could be a career. And so around May 2015, I started drawing these little comics that were just goofy ideas I had, just doodling out things more than anything. But I was also transitioning and going through this process of exploring my gender and understanding myself. And there was just so many things happening with that where I knew I had to, like, this is too funny not to talk about, or this is too heavy. I need to talk about this in some way because it's weighing on my soul and I need to get it out somehow. So if you look at those earlier sort of trans-related comics, the first Life of Bria strips, I even called them Life of Bria, because not all of the comics, I didn't want to make a comic about myself, actually. The earliest ones are all just random. And then I started drawing myself, because like, all right, fine, I'll draw myself. And if you look at them, they start out kind of funny, but then they start getting heavier and heavier because I needed to explore this gender angst. And there's this whole block of time for most of 2015 going into 2016 where it's kind of going back and forth between goofy one-off thing and then these sort of deep existential gender feels I was working through. And then around like 2016, there was a lot more backlash happening in the United States, especially with trans rights in particular. You have your bathroom bills kind of coming into, North Carolina's HB2, I think, was the one that really struck me. And so I started feeling like, there's this big transgender tipping point, as I think it was Time magazine or some magazine cover with Laverne Cox called it. And I was like, yeah, this is a major, like, kind of watershed moment, a turning point in history, perhaps, where the trans community, which has been super stigmatized, and I had all this baggage I'd been kind of unpacking around shame and my gender feelings that I'd never seen explored in the public. Now that's in the public eye. And it's got us in the crosshairs. And there's this movement happening where we've got my community wanting our rights and recognition, and then this backlash against us trying to push us back down to where I just dug myself out of, really. Yeah. And I was like, I don't want to just stand, idly by and be silent here. I want to, for better or for worse, say I did something during this time, whatever small thing I felt I could do. So I started doing these comics of working through bigoted talking points, just the sorts of things that perhaps I told myself before I came out, and I was now hearing others say against us in a public arena and trying to pass laws and such. And so I didn't want to make political comics either when I first started, but this was just too much. I had to. There's no way I could not do something. And then so there's this whole block of time, 2016 going into, I mean, I still do it today, but I was really into it like 2017 after Donald Trump was elected and all that. It just ramped up more and more. And so, yeah, then it became these political talking through, my most popular segment, I call it a segment because it's framed like a television show, like a daytime talk show, Talking with Bigots. And that was partially just as a format to talk through whatever, goofy thing these people would say about us. But it was also actually an attempt to reclaim this daytime talk show kind of aesthetic where
Jerry Springer,
which
unfortunately has not helped over the years.
No. These are the sorts of things that I think have kept us down.
Yeah.
And the LGBT community broadly. But I've tried to like make a lot of my work more inclusive of queer, gay perspectives rather than just the trans thing all the time. But I think the trans stuff is what I had the most unresolved feelings about. So that's why I would be working through a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And talking about, my experience coming out as a lesbian and also identifying somewhere on that asexual spectrum because, these things are all related and these parts of our community, like sometimes we're portrayed as being unified, but we're not always. And I didn't know exactly how to navigate that fully. I didn't want to be speaking for others, and I didn't want to be dwelling on things that I hadn't fully resolved myself, but wasn't also feeling urgently needing to get out. So I actually talk about a lot more less trans-specific things, in particular in my new book, coming out again, available in fine bookstores everywhere.
We'll definitely be covering that.
That one just came out, and pun definitely intended. So talking though specifically about trans stuff was the focus for most of it, with a little veering off into gay and bi and ace and various other things that I think as I'm getting more confident about, but always deathly afraid of speaking for communities that aren't my own specifically.
Yeah, and I think that's something everybody, once people start hearing and responding, then you begin to realize, oh wait, you know what? I thought I understood. Not quite, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I actually have a note here to say if there was like a specific point, but yeah, I think of the earlier ones as I was reading them recently. I put them into three categories: the silly one-off stuff that's just sort of like, this is a funny joke; the personal stuff where you're telling your own story, and then there was some political stuff early on. I feel like it has grown much more political and much more pointed over time, and especially, and I have a note here, great comeback arguments, because there are like entire comics that, and I've used one or two recently where I see something like that and I'm just like, oh, forget it. You know what? I'm not typing this out. Here you go. Somebody's already done this. Got it. That
was part of why I made it too. You just respond with this. There you go. It's all laid out.
And do you find, does that help you when you hear this stuff in real life or even online or whatever? Like you're kind of equipped with this now. You've thought this through. You've come up with a snarky response, but also a very well informed and well reasoned response. Does that make it any easier to deal with?
I think it does for the individual dealing with it. Like, I don't know if any of these things would ever convince the other side, because people only change their minds when they think they've changed their mind. You can't convince somebody of anything as far as I'm concerned, especially when it comes to these, like, we're talking about bigotry or prejudice, people's biases. The only way somebody's going to change their mind about it is if they decide to do so. And then they'll say, this was my idea all along. I'm actually good and smart, and that's why I'm no longer believing this thing. But I wanted to make these comics, a lot of the more political ones, as being like, look, fellow trans and queer people, these people that say these awful things, they're wrong. And here's why they're wrong. So don't trouble your brain about it. Like, not to say you should stop thinking, but I had a lot of worry and anxiety I was carrying around and just feeling bad about myself, hearing these awful things all the time. And then having to have some little thing I could look at and be like, no, wait, they're wrong, though. That's ridiculous. And here's all the reasons why.
Yeah. And there are three characters, two of which I think you bounce a lot of this stuff off of. I wonder if we could talk about these three. Turfy Swerfy.
Yeah.
Fucking beard guy, I believe was his name. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And then before we get to those, I got to ask you, what's the deal with the cartoon dinosaur? That's
Oh
kind
yeah.
of like it's your conscience or something, or I don't know if that's
Oh
the
yeah.
way I should read
That's
it or what.
Daiki dinosaur.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Daiki dinosaur.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about Daiki first, I suppose, before we
Yeah.
get
What's
but
Daiki all
well,
about?
she was just like I was like 2018 and I was honestly like a little tired of doing the political thing for a while, but I also didn't want to just stop doing like goofy little comics because it was a good exercise, good thing to keep doing, putting out some little cartoon. And I just want something a little fresh, a little different. So I just started drawing this other character. I was also drawing this other comic series, which I've kind of put on hold, but I will return to. It was more action adventure. It's called Starfish Gemini.
Yes, I actually wanted to ask you about that.
I that one's very close to my heart. I'd love to talk about it at
Oh
length.
yeah.
But I was sort of drawing that at the time. I was drawing dinosaurs and stuff, and I was like, yeah, but I could just like have a cartoon character that's that too. And I even like I was thinking like, oh, I could almost link these two worlds. And what if it was like Daiki Dinosaur was like an actor? Because I think one of her early comic strips was like she was complaining about how in Jurassic Park they had like effectively trans dinosaurs, but they didn't cast a trans dinosaur in it. It was, sort of a facetious little thing. And so I was like, oh, what if she's like an actor that's cast in Starfish Gemini and like I'm the creator of it, but like I'm not like necessarily attached to the production. And like there's the big muscular lesbian Kaya the Invincible in that story. And I wanted to have it be almost like I'm like hoping Daiki can like, can Kaya, the actress that's playing Kaya, can you like introduce her to me? I was trying to get into something that I never ended up going there because I put Starfist on hold temporarily. But yeah, it was just an attempt to kind of have something fresh and new. And now she's just like part of the cast. And
Yeah.
I've had like furry characters and like non-human characters because it's just like you should have a space in art where you can do anything, like just
Right.
anything goes. So it's just good to be able to just like, yeah, sure, there's a dinosaur now, deal with it. Too bad. Like, does it really change it that much if people who are concerned about realism in a cartoon strip, And she's just an avenue where I can have a bit of goofiness sometimes or like a conscience from myself. I like the idea of making myself a little bit more the butt of the joke if I can right now.
Right.
I don't always want to be like, I'm righteous, smart lady who's going to say the right thing all the time because I don't say the right thing all the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because you're right. It does. You are making a point, especially when you have the character, which is you. And a lot of times, and you're far from the only person, transgender artist making comic strips out there. But it's honestly, as I think about them, and I've interviewed quite a few over the years, I don't know that anybody else literally dropped themselves into it the way that you have. I mean, there's a lot will have a character that they speak through, but you've literally, nope, that's me. I'm in the comic. And yet it doesn't come off as preachy. It's got to be a tough balance to strike sometimes.
I mean, I don't know how to feel when people tell me like, oh, you're way prettier than your drawing of yourself. Or some people say, oh, you look exactly like your drawing of yourself. It's like, well, okay, I'll take both of these as compliments.
Yeah, both of those are okay. Oh, you draw yourself really well. Maybe it's not.
I mean, I never wanted to be like this, honestly. I don't want to misrepresent myself in these comics. I can't make art that I don't believe in or I'm not sincere in. So I'm not going to write anything I don't believe in. And I don't want to draw myself in a way that I think is self-aggrandizing beyond. I mean, I personally think, and if I can, yeah, sure, I'll give a little brag here. Not that it is anything. I think I'm funnier in person than I am in my comics. And that's the thing I've actually struggled with a lot. And I think I downplay myself in my comics, if anything. Again, if probably this counts as some kind of humble brag. I'm not trying to. It's something I'm very.
Well, you have to be funny to write funny comics. I mean,
but it's a weird kind of humor, I think, that comes like the sort of person that jokes around, in a friend group, you're talking versus like a one-liner, this great zinger comic. Like it's a weird thing to tread. And I mean, obviously I can do it to some degree because people read my comics, but I always felt there's like a disconnect there between myself and my cartoon self. Like, I'm not quite getting my whole self, but that's okay. Because again, I don't want my cartoon self to be some kind of aggrandizement of myself. Certainly, I'd rather she be, I guess, like a figurehead more than anything. It's a handy thing.
Yeah.
And like I said, I didn't want to do a comic about myself at first. It just kind of worked out that way. Just because of what I was going through. And then these arguments I'm responding to, it was like me kind of working it through for myself,
Yeah. So it should be pretty obvious to anybody who, has spent 5 minutes on the internet and has ever been in a transgender issue related discussion. But tell me a little bit about the two antagonists here, if you will, Turfy, Swerfy, and fucking Beard Guy.
Well, I think fucking beard guy who does have a first name. It's only ever mentioned briefly because who cares? I think his name's Derek.
Oh,
Also,
okay.
he came first. And
Yeah.
he was based on a real person, but it wasn't a person I knew. It was just
Okay.
like this rando in some comment section saying these things, and he just was sort of scruffy with a beard. I don't have anything against people with beards, by the way. I dated a lovely man with a beard for years, and we're still best pals. See, I can't be biased against people with beards when my best friends have beards.
There you go. Yeah,
Uh,
friends with beards. Yeah.
but it was just this guy, and it was just like, who are you, man, that you're saying this? He was like talking like he's an expert on stuff. He's just some schlubby guy, just like, man, you are so mediocre. You're just some guy. And like
Right.
I'd see more and more guys who are you're just some guy and you're talking like you're some kind of brilliant expert, you know, about science and philosophy, but you clearly are talking out of your ass. And you just he's a generic guy. I think I've done a few comics where it was just like there's multiple beard guys. They're just all the same.
Right. Well, I had a hard time, and I wasn't like I was looking to try to say, oh, this is the first appearance of Beard Guy, but because I kind of read them a little bit out of order because I was working backwards at first, and I decided to go back to 15 and work my way through. And he evolved a bit because sometimes his hair is straight and sometimes it's curly, and you know, sometimes like he's all cross-eyed and there's flies going around him. And other times he's just like a normal guy, you know. But yeah, he did kind of evolve a bit. But yeah, like I say, it's sort of the generic. I thought like neck beard a little bit. Like he wasn't drawn with a neck beard, but I think of like, you know, fucking neck beards. You know,
I feel like he's like a guy who thinks he's like an alpha male because he's not a neck beard, but really he's just thoroughly average. He's just
right.
A guy, and with self-aggrandizement, he believes he's the smartest man in the world to some degree.
And there's certainly no shortage of them on the internet, or in the world for that matter.
Well, that's just it. We've got this phenomenon happening of Trump supporters. I'm just going to lean into this.
Oh no, by all means.
Like I feel at this point, it's like, is anyone really surprised that I would have this opinion? But like this movement of these sort of mega hard right conservative white guys, white cis straight guys that just think they're the center of the universe and that everything needs to cater to them and they're right about everything and everyone else has gone crazy. No, it's the children who are wrong. You know, like they're just so sure. They're so arrogant, and they they accuse, you know, us SJWs and trans activists of, you know, being entitled and everything being self-centered. It's like, no, man, you're self-centered and entitled. You think everybody else should have to do what you say, and they say they want freedom, but really they want authoritarianism.
Yes,
they can't make up their mind as to who they really are.
But they
really
say we want authoritarianism. They turn that around and say you guys are trying to. I found it's a lot easier to understand the conservative when you look at everything through the lens of projection.
Oh, totally.
Because you can't do what you just did, what you just said, like saying, no, it's you guys that do that. It's not like that's like the weakest argument, right? But once they've made the statement, you can't counter it. You can't just say, well, no, that's you guys. Because when you say that, you sound weak, and whatever.
And
but it's like, no, it's totally true.
Well, I think it's an intentional strategy. A lot of it is they're trying to muddy the waters of fact and fiction. Yep. It was a very specific campaign, especially online. You know, we can go into Russian bots or whatever. Who knows how many of these are real people or they're paid shills. You've got your grifters on YouTube and elsewhere that just repeat talking points, but a lot of it is just we're going to muddy the waters, almost like preempting your argument against us by accusing you of the same thing and get all the eyes on you and shift. Like they've done a masterful job of controlling the narrative for years.
Oh yeah.
We're always playing defense and they're always getting to accuse us of basically what they're doing. And now because they've muddied the waters, an outsider would just look and be like, I don't know who to believe. This one person saying this thing and this other person saying this thing. Yeah. I'm going to be objective here and just assume there must be both equally valid. But this one is getting upset about it. So that one must be wrong.
Right. And the other one was first to the punch. When you're first to the punch on that, you have an advantage. And it's just... Yeah. Like you say, they have done a masterful job of controlling the narrative, and so Turfy Swerfy.
Well, she's the other, the blue demon in our this dichotomy of evils. She originally was based kind of on this idea of like those old 70s second wave feminists that I grew up with these people. Like I remember a specific, as I actually grew up on like a hippie island. It's a beautiful place to grow up, but full of second wavy, turfy kind of ideas. I don't think any of them would explicitly back then explicitly identify as TERFs, but I heard this kind of stuff growing up, and it did not have a positive effect on me. This kind of, I hate to use the term, but man-hating, stodgy second wave feminist that everything is about the phallus versus the yoni or whatever.
Right.
Talking about, these really nasty ways of thinking about gender, especially. And, you've got a real life true blue admitting it and calling themselves proudly, until all of a sudden it's now a slur according to them, even though they started calling themselves TERFs. I'm not going to name any specific names, but these kind of, I think in one comic I described them as a washed up academic from the 70s, because a lot of them were. But the truth is, she covers a lot of these turfy talking points from this faux feminist perspective. I always spell TERF with a small f, because it's just a little jab at them. It's like, look, you're not real feminists, and the broader feminist community doesn't really take you seriously. You're just cosplaying as feminists because you get clout. And then right-wing organizations can hold them, see, oh, these feminists don't agree with the trans agenda. See?
I love the comic you've got with it's the puppet show, right? So you've got the radical feminists here, and then when the guys like poke his head down back into frame, you just see it's the religious right, or it's Christian conservatives, and that is such an odd. I mean, politics makes strange bedfellows, but that is like one of those where you have lost your way when you have essentially linked arms with the people you've been fighting your entire lives. Like, absolutely, you've lost your way when that has happened. And I guess I want to ask: were the talking points as you heard them back then? Growing up, were they as explicit as they are today? Because it's not surprising that there would be people saying this today as trans issues have come to the forefront. Whereas you go back in time, it's almost a non-existent. Most people, I mean, it's weird to say nobody even knew a trans person. Well, they did. They just didn't know that they did. Oh, yeah. But it was it definitely was not in the forefront the way it is today. So it almost seems like it wouldn't be like what it wouldn't be productive for them to be talking about it in direct terms. But it's interesting to hear you say that the way that they're talking about gender in such strict and such not very positive and not very enlightened ways. Which again, at the time, I mean, not that if you go back in time from where they are, we weren't exactly enlightened about gender either, like baby steps, but it's interesting to hear.
I think it's because they largely won. They kind of won in the 80s. We were like, they had the TERFs both in the United States and Canada. I can't speak to other places' experience, but I imagine it wasn't too different. They managed to get the ear of lawmakers and policymakers, and they were able to basically mandate us out of the public eye to some degree. Trans healthcare was massively hobbled in my province here, which today, British Columbia in Canada, is probably one of the best places in the world to be transgender. But for decades, it was not. And that was because the TERFs had successfully gotten the ear of the people in charge of healthcare, and they kind of crushed us. We were just at the margins. We were so out of public eye that we weren't even worthy of being a target. But those stodgy bioessentialist ideas about sex and gender continued and remained, and second wave feminism was the dominant force of feminism, certainly in these like hippie communities like I was in, these old hippies from the 60s and 70s that went to university. Like even my mom's one of my biggest supporters these days, and honestly, she identifies as genderqueer herself and has a much more nuanced relationship with sex and gender today, partially because of my coming out and talking about these things. But she was very second wave feministy. Germaine Greer was one of her favorite authors. Yeah. And she didn't even know she was anti-trans. She just read her other work.
Right.
And that bleeds into it because Germaine Greer is coming at sex and gender from a very specific mindset, which causes her to be anti-trans. But most of the time, it's not about that. It's about these other things. And so it's all connected. Even if you're not specifically talking about trans people, your attitudes in these things will reflect your attitudes regarding trans people.
Right. And it wasn't like after they won, as you put it, after they took control of both the movement and then started influencing policy, then we come into the Reagan years, at least in the States, and it's not like we were going to get a newer version of anything at that point for a good decade. It's like now we're coming into a more reactionary phase. So it's like we're not going to evolve for a while yet. And it wasn't until well into the 90s that we were even beginning to then come around and talk about it again, even at least not any mainstream narrative.
The 90s, you start getting people talking about it, but it was still like on the margins. It was not really on trans people's terms. And then early 2000s, I think we're starting to gain a little bit of momentum, but again, still not really in a
Yeah.
positive way overall. And it wasn't like, honestly, like I came out 2015 and we've moved light years in those 5 years.
Yeah.
And like, I feel like in 2015, it was a far cry from where we were in 2010. There's no way I was going to come out in 2010. I
Right.
mean, like I couldn't admit it to myself, let alone the world. And it's amazing how quickly it has changed in like, say, the last 10 years, I'd say, because it was just this slow, incremental clawing back up from the abyss after being obliterated for so
Right.
long.
And you mentioned your mom in your comics. Your mom's made a few appearances, and your dad was in there too. It seems like your parents were more supportive than most trans. Well, at least let's go back 10 years, because today it
Yeah.
might be completely different. But if you go 2015, 2010, 2000 back, it seems like your parents were more supportive than what might be typical of the time. Or are we getting that through the lens of what you're presenting in the comics?
I was extremely fortunate. Both my parents and my sibling as well were very supportive. My mom had trouble at first because this her sort of second wave stuff, and she was afraid of mostly surgery type stuff. She actually said to me, I'm sorry I have to dump this out here, Mom, if you listen to this, but she said to me, you're too smart to have to, adhere to a gender. You could be like androgynous, you could be beyond gender. There's very much this kind of academic idea of gender norms and ideas about your body being like, somehow immaterial. It's not important.
Right. And it's and that is an identity that somebody can have,
totally, yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily yours. That's like the thing. It's like, yeah, that's a possibility, but that's not me.
And it also isn't taking into account like all the possibilities a person could have. You're not taking into account the idea that a person's body actually can be out of alignment with how they feel. It's not just about your attitude regarding your body. That's an important thing. I've had to do a lot of work on myself to like love myself and my body as it is. But I also had to change my body a whole bunch. There was no way I was going to be totally okay with my body as it was. It wasn't right for me. And that's on like an intuitive feeling in my body level. Like I honestly go to sleep every night just feeling really great in my body. I'm comfortable in my own skin in a way I never was and was never going to be then. No matter what academic philosophy I read about gender, no matter what kind of radical acceptance I had of myself. And I do regret being not very free in my gender expression back then because I just wasn't able to. But now I can have a lot of those feelings, but also feel at home in my own skin because of how I've shaped it for myself. Right. And so I had to argue with my mom about that kind of stuff for a few months.
And it's not something that she would understand because it's not something that she herself ever had to really consider.
Well, I mean, I don't want to talk about my mom business too much, but you know what? As I said, she's genderqueer. She has a lot of gendery feels, and my mom's awesome that way. She's done she did this really great number written by the Canadian composer Rod Sharman. Yeah, I feel like Rod would be upset if I didn't mention that he wrote it. My mom performed his piece, The Pronoun Symphony. And it's like the sort of cabaret number when my mom dresses up as like this old school marm and lectures on, people's pronouns and not just assuming gender norms about someone, and did the variety of gender identity. Like it's I think often people who struggle with a lot of these issues, I've said this before, and it can be a little controversial these days, but most of the time when a person is really upset about anything, whether it's sexuality or gender, or even just like other behaviors that people have, that if someone's getting like super upset about something that isn't really affecting them in any way, maybe there's something there. Maybe you're, I hate to use the word, a little triggered. and I people have this idea of like triggering only pertaining to say PTSD, but it's this kind of, you're having an emotional response that's deeper than the thing that you are responding to. This is something deep in your soul that you're not happy with, say. Something that's affected you. It could be a trauma. It could be some ongoing issue that you haven't worked out. But most quote unquote normal people, healthy people, they look at a trans person living their life and they're like, oh, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Or good for them.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Well, it's the cliche or the trope being that the biggest homophobe is a closet case, more or less.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people that don't like that because they're like, oh, you're blaming basically queers for queer phobia. And I see that society has a role.
I mean, you can't win if you go around in enough circles, but yeah.
But it does not help us to ignore that fact. I've talked to so many queer people who are like, oh yeah, before I came out, I was like, really homophobic, really transphobic, and it's like, nowadays, whenever I'm like responding to something with either jealousy or feeling threatened or any kind of intense negativity like that, I have to take a step back and be like, what is this? Why do I feel this way? Because I shouldn't feel this way necessarily. Like, I'm not actually threatened here. Why am I responding in this way? And I think a lot of people don't do that. Then they
Right.
think, no, they're bad. It's the children who are wrong. It's never their fault.
No, of course.
No, I'm very secure in my gender. Thank you very much. It's you who are wrong about your gender. And, but whereas most people who are happy with their gender or their sexuality or anything else, they go off and live their life, no problem.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned trans healthcare in British Columbia. You mentioned culture. We're talking about culture around gender. And I find it interesting. Was it around the time that you're transitioning, you were living in Thailand at the time?
Yeah.
Which historically has been kind of on the forefront of certainly transition related surgeries, but also, and again, I'm not going to necessarily invoke the Thai culture here as saying it's particularly enlightened or relevant to trans issues here, but there was a culture there that didn't exist elsewhere. And I wonder if that was like how you're in Thailand, you're seeing this, you're struggling with some of this stuff yourself, but you're still in denial, or how did that play into it? The fact that you were there of all places at this time.
Well, I traveled to Thailand initially as a way to get out of the city after I had stage 4 cancer. And I honestly, that dug up my gender feels, got me thinking about what really matters. Almost dying has a way of making us reevaluate what matters to us in life. Right. And I almost did transition basically during cancer. And then again, a year after I dealt with cancer, but I didn't want to break up with my girlfriend who had been dating for like 7 years. And we were going to go on this big trip before I got cancer, but that was canceled. And so it was like, you know what, maybe I don't need to do this gender thing. Maybe we just need to get out of here. Let's go on an adventure like we used to, because we traveled a lot before. And, we went away to Thailand and became art teachers. She was the high school art teacher. I was the elementary art teacher in this big international school. And it was like this time I was living there, it was really cool. And I was like in great shape. I'd beaten cancer with my beautiful partner who I love, doing this awesome job in an awesome place, beautiful. And I was still unhappy. It was still coming back. And it was just like I was left alone for long periods of time because Thailand, they hired me to be the art teacher. And then they're like, oh yeah, but we didn't schedule any elementary art classes this term. So you've got 6 to 8 weeks with nothing to do, and you can sit in the art room alone, basically. They still paid me and they found a couple things for me to do, but for the most part I was just sitting alone preparing the art room for when I would have classes. And being left alone with your thoughts in such a situation has a way of, again, making you think about what really matters and what you want. And so, I was in Thailand and feeling this way, and I really didn't want to have to do it. Really, I promised I wasn't going to do it. Like, say, if I had to do it, I would go home, get a doctor to do it and all that. But I was like, you know what? I'm feeling this now. We can't actually leave yet because we're still on contract. I need to do this. And I came out to my girlfriend, and it was hard, of course. And we did end up separating over it, but we're still very close. But I was over in Thailand, and honestly, it was the best place to start it in many ways. In certain ways, it wasn't great. I couldn't find a doctor who would treat me. There were ads in the newspaper for hospitals giving out steroids to foreigners that come for like roid vacations to like, or traincations, I think they call it. Westerners come over to work out and lift weights. It's a huge culture over there doing Muay Thai, and then you can take some steroids. And like there's hospitals advertising that. And then I go and ask them about transition care, and they're like, the doctor would look very stern. We don't do that sort of thing here. This very like judgmental attitude, like, okay. So I just started buying hormones over the counter from pharmacies, and like I did my research. I figured out the usual starting dose, especially for someone of my weight and height. And I knew eventually I'd have to get a doctor to care for me, which is part of why I ended up moving back home. But in terms of starting out in Thailand and having to kind of take things into my own hands and, just sort of take care of myself wasn't the worst thing. I hate to say it. I'm not advocating anybody do it yourself, but it made me seize control over my own life. And it made me feel very free and empowered in my gender and my transition. And every Thai person I met outside of those stodgy doctors, they were cool with it. Like I remember I came,
and that's the subculture that's there. I mean, there is,
It was really nice in a lot of ways. Foreigners didn't get it, and the customs flying out of the country was really nice. They're like, oh, you look very beautiful. It was really scary flying back home, presenting as female, but still having a masculine passport. But like Thai, the officials were like, hey, thumbs up. Like, you're doing great. It was really sweet. Thailand was not a bad place, at least as a foreigner, to be trans.
Interesting. They mentioned earlier about, well, you used the word controversy, and I want to ask about a couple of controversial things. One of the things that struck me, and it's around this time period, we went, well, while you were in Thailand, you're talking about some of those times and telling some stories in the comics of that time period. But more than any, I think, I want to say I don't know that I've ever seen another trans cartoonist or comic book writer talk about themselves prior to transitioning, even going so far. I mean, you talk about Steven a lot, and you talk about how much it's interesting because you treat yourself as both, as it's obviously yourself, but also you invoke it as if this person still exists and is still important to you and is still part of your life. And that's really, I've never seen anyone do that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and about what that's all about. Because I can imagine we before the interview, we were talking, and again, you said the word dead name, which struck me as odd because you actually used it in the comic. That's what I was asking you, if I could ask you about that. But it, like you say, I mean, you dead named yourself in your own comic. And so tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I think I would have written a lot of those strips again in that 2015 period where I was doing personal exploration through comics. And the person who I was in the closet, I name him in the comment. It's easier to write it than to say it. I have a hard time saying it out loud, so I probably won't, which is fine. Like, it's not like I'm upset hearing it at this point in my life. But they were somebody who was larger than life. And that was because they were effectively a character I created to live my life. I did a lot of martial arts. I did a lot of weightlifting. I was this big heroic figure, this sort of almost like, I hate to say it, but like folk hero amongst my friends in high school. This cult of personality kind of formed around me to some degree. Not that I ever tried to embrace that or capitalize off it. I just was like trying to be an upstanding, powerful young man, a Herculean type figure who did everything. Because really what it is, it's the flight into hypermasculinity. It's such a common thing in trans women, and this, I'm going to gender as hard as I can because I never feel good enough, essentially. And I was medicating all those years with exercise. I was training harder and harder, I think up until I sort of collapsed and needed to transition. I mean, I got down to training. I'd be like 5 hours a day sometimes, plus I'd go teach martial arts for 5 to 6 hours, and I rode my bicycle everywhere. Like, it was that degree of hyper training to be some kind of superhero or something, you know?
And perhaps not healthy psychologically. I can think of worse ways to self-medicate, but still, obviously you're really struggling with something.
People like to moralize addictions, if it's heroin or it's alcoholism, but like, everybody's addicted to something to some degree. Everybody's filling up that hole in themselves with something. It's just some things that people fill their hole with are more socially acceptable or to some degree beneficial. I mean, I was getting back problems and wrist problems and shoulder problems.
Too much of anything is still too much. It's still bad. Yeah.
But it's part of why I was able to beat cancer. I stayed active through cancer, and I honestly, like, it was stage 4 cancer. It was fairly bad. It was like a 50-50 chance of making it through, but I actually did pretty well with it. I actually kind of beat it pretty badly.
Right. Before we go back to talking about the comics, let's talk about this a little bit, because you kick a lot of ass between the martial arts stuff, which you do talk about both in the comic, but I've also seen, like, you talk about it on Facebook and whatnot. And then, you beat cancer. I mean, like, holy shit, how cool is that? That's incredible.
That one came out of left field. I never would have expected I'd get cancer, which is also like, it was really hard to get diagnosed because nobody wanted to believe this extremely strong karate expert man was going to have cancer. So it was actually very hard to get that diagnosis.
Wow.
But I think, again, it's that filling that hole of like never feeling good enough because gender, not feeling right in the role of a man. I was also looking for some kind of socially acceptable avenue of masculinity that I could stomach. And frankly, I hated most expressions of mainstream Western masculinity, like to the point where I described my gender in high school as being martial arts. I basically did martial arts all the time. I dressed in martial arts clothes. I only watched like kung fu movies from Hong Kong or maybe Japanese studios. And like, I didn't want to participate in masculinity, but all at the same time, I had to some degree because I'm a man, right? and I wasn't prepared to like be femme. I didn't, because it was like, it's a weird thing growing up in the closet as trans and knowing, say you're a trans woman, say, but you don't know that, but all anyone talks about is, say, a gay man. And I was surrounded by a lot of gay role models. Most of my mom's friends were queer, gay men and women, but I wasn't like attracted to men. I wasn't interested in sex with a man as a man, but I knew I wasn't quote unquote normal. I didn't feel like all these normie heterosexuals, but I knew I
Right.
wasn't a gay man. So where did that leave me, you know?
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
I was just trying to have something I could hold on to. And that thing, that socially acceptable activity for men to do, was martial arts and physical training. And it made me feel good. I had a lot of body image issues, of course, at the time. So I was like, oh, I'll change my body to be something that I like, something
Oh,
that society
a
values,
good
you know?
thought. That was a good theory.
Yeah.
You just went in completely the wrong direction with it, I
Yeah.
guess. But yeah,
And
wow.
when I did transition, I was like, you know what? I've got this body of knowledge. I've been doing this physical training to change my body in one way or another for like, it was like almost a decade at that point. And I was like, I could use this. I could use my training knowledge like, to transition and maybe at least feel empowered in my body and have some degree of control over it. And so I kept up with it to some degree. And I did stop doing martial arts for a period of time because it was actually too painful. I was too tied to my old self and I was worrying I was just playing into a trap of these habits. This thing I was medicating with for so many years. I was like, is this what I really want? Is
Right,
this like really me? Or is this just the thing I latched onto when I was adrift at sea in the closet and not understanding myself? So
right,
I kind of left martial arts behind for a few years. That's actually one reason why I stopped drawing Starfish Gemini, is I was like, I'm kind of hiding in my feelings here, or hiding from my feelings in this comic and in this training. I need to experience the absence of this strength and this power. I
right.
need to experience vulnerability, softness. And I sort of went off in a period of time. Honestly, I was depressed because I had my guiding light, this training and it wasn't just the physical, it was a belief in myself and a belief that I could do anything if I tried, basically, this
Yeah.
confidence to some degree. And I kind of lost that. And I honestly, I'm not a religious person per se, but I think it's very similar to a person losing their faith in God. You lose your thing that you
Mhm.
used as your North Star. And now what? And I was kind of adrift for a few years without it, trying to do what I could and exploring the absence of this thing. And it's honestly only in the last few months I've actually started returning to it in a big way. I've been training really hard and just enjoying being at one with that person. So going back to, say, dead name Stephen, old me, this heroic figure that I kind of created to feel comfortable in the world, I separated myself from them, but at the same time was trying to like be an evolution of them, but then realized, you know what, maybe that's not the real me. I need to try just being somebody else, separate
Right.
myself even further, which was not healthy. And now I've kind of returned to converging and I feel more integrated with my past self. I feel like my life is a more extended, ongoing story of myself rather than separate individual people.
Mm.
It might actually be very interesting to do some work, a comic or something involving my past self again, because I haven't in a long time and my feelings on it have matured to a great degree. And I think there's a rich vein there of something.
Right. Do want to ask about Starfish Gemini and also some of the other comics that you've done, because it's not just Life of Bria. You've branched out quite a bit. I just want to touch on a couple of individual comics that stand out to me. One, and there's no question here, I just think it's brilliant. You have this one that was fairly recent about the free speech of not Nazis. I think you say fascists, but the free speech of fascists. And the question is asked, like, where do you draw the line if fascists don't have free speech? And so it's the classic slippery slope. And I'd never thought about it this way, but your character, comes straight out and says, we're going to draw the line right here. This is the line. This is, nobody talked about drawing it anywhere else. Oh, and by the way, you already drew the line. Like,
Yeah.
the idea of where do you draw the line? Well, let's draw it exactly where the fascists put it. And I'm like, when I read that, I was, because you always are trying to argue against this slippery slope. And to be fair, a lot of times in life, you can, some things are a slippery slope, not everything. Not everything needs to be. But the idea that we don't actually have to decide where to draw the line. You guys drew it already for us.
Yeah.
That's That was amazing. And again, like I say, there's no question here. I just want to tell you that was amazing.
Thank you. I want to add to the end of that, of course. I think the final thing is, and also, like, why are you on that side of it? Like, you just so happen to be like the person who's talking. There's like the Nazi, and then the guy's talking. Oh, what about where's the line gonna be? It's like, well, you just so happen to be on the other side of it. Why? Like all of us, I think there's like queer and disabled and
everybody. Yeah,
it's like the Nazis drew this line when they said they don't want us to exist, and you just so happen to be on the other side of it, and you're defending them. You could be over here with us, but you're choosing to stand with them, and that's very telling.
Right, exactly. And it's like, yeah, we're not drawing a line. We're acknowledging there's a line here, but they drew it.
Yeah.
It was just that's one of those things in life where every now and then you get an argument or a piece of knowledge given to you, and it's just just mind blowing. And that was one of those for me, because I was like, holy shit, she just annihilated the slippery slope argument here. We're not drawing the line. You drew it. That's amazing.
Well,
but some of the controversial stuff, because you're certainly not afraid to take on anything, and even like you say, there's a bit of self-deprecating humor in there as well. Like, for example, there's, I don't even know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, the tyrannization and transmetal, and I'm almost like, I read this last week, not in 2016 when it was written, but I'm like, are you making an attack helicopter joke there or what?
Yeah, those other ones, like, I was in a different place in a lot of ways. As I said, the comic itself has evolved, and I've evolved too. And those older ones, like, I've never been one of those people that was like, oh, you're making up new genders or whatever. It was like, I think a lot of those are coming out of my own insecurity in a lot of ways. And I do think also a lot of, like, say, true scummy people, the trans people that don't want there to be non-binary identities or gender non-conforming trans people, even, like, they have this true transsexual mindset of you've got to be this or that to be a real trans. I think they're insecure. I hate to say it, but usually they're trans women who struggle in some way or another. Maybe they get misgendered. Maybe they've had to go through a lot of gatekeeping. Maybe they've worked very hard to have their gender and they're clinging to it like a security blanket.
Right.
And threatened by all these kids coming along, and they're breaking all the rules and not suffering the way they suffer.
Right.
And they're threatened by that, basically. And I think when I was making those jokes, it was almost like, I think Caitlyn Jenner came out like slightly after I'd come out, and she kind of stole my thunder, I felt like. And like, it was just like making goofy just jokes about things. I don't think I was even aware enough of broader gender politics at the time to make a point beyond, like, this is a goofy pun.
Right.
Metal or I love dinosaurs, so transitioning. Like, it was like, I'm going to do something even more extreme than what I'm doing. That'll show Caitlyn Jenner or whoever. Like,
right.
Like, I don't even know what I was doing for a lot of those comics, because, as I said, it was like this weird, like, I just got to make comics, I guess. We'll see what comes out of it.
And a couple that are less, I don't think was necessarily a humorous point here so much as a philosophical exploration. There's one, I believe that the title is Resent the Identifier. And it's weird because I've heard this from cis people. And one in particular it's one of those where you always feel like you have to qualify. They have nothing against trans people, but but they would ask questions like, why do I have to be a cisgender woman? Why can't I just be a woman? Well, you are a woman, but this is an adjective that exists in the language. Nobody's asking you to use the label, but it's a word that describes a thing that you happen to be like, and it's weird to try to explain that. And this is not somebody suggesting that cis is a slur, but merely like, and at one point in exasperation, I'm just like, so what? Do you just want transgender and normal? Is that what you're looking for here? Because words have opposites. You create us up, you have down, but you turn that around a bit because you talk about from your own perspective saying, well, am I a trans woman or am I just a woman? Can I just be a woman? Do I have to put the word transgender in front of that? And I guess, is that where of your feelings? Because again, you talk about how there's been an evolution, there's been this exploration. Where would you be on something like that now?
I think about that strip a lot. I know exactly the one you're talking about. I think it opens with my face saying, like, I am not transgender.
Yes.
And I think today I would say I am, just because I have a more integrated view of my life. And I see the things that I've lived through and all the stuff that I've experienced as a transgender woman as having value. Even though there's a lot of pain with it, it's made me into somebody that I like overall. And having that integration with my whole self makes it easier for me to be okay with the label. But I do think, and I've heard other trans people say that the word transgender is inherently coming from a cis perspective to some degree. It's like
Right.
I wouldn't be transgender if cis people didn't insist on labeling me as, say, a boy before, and then me
Right.
having to go through all this. Like that was an imposition put onto me. Other people created that word, and now I have to identify myself around it,
Yeah.
especially it being this very otherizing term in a lot of cases. It's a weird thing to be miffed about, but I don't like it when people spell it like trans woman, all one word,
Hmm.
trans man, all
Yes.
and you notice TERFs and anti-trans people, they do that very intentionally because they know that words matter and language
Yeah.
matters, and they want to otherize us by saying, no, there's women and trans women.
Right. Trans becomes a noun, not an adjective.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's a lot of what I was really feeling at the time. It was just like, you know what? You don't get to tell me who I am. Oh, because I had to live this life that I wasn't exactly happy about. And I've had to go through this big, long, painful process. For now, the rest of my life, I have to be labeled with something that otherizes me and
Right.
you use to, delegitimize who I am. You know what? You don't
Yes.
get to decide who I am. I'm who I say I am. That I think that's definitely, I still believe that to some degree, but
Right.
the trans thing specifically, it's like, look, I went through this process. I lived this life. It made me who I am. That's okay. I think
Right.
that's where I'm landing right now. But actually, again, just like the comic about myself, I kind of want to retread that particular comic too, because I think I have more to say on the matter.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's interesting because you talk about the how the term is inherently othering and whatnot. And I wonder if this individual is not a little bit miffed that maybe they're experiencing the smallest feeling of othering, but
Yeah.
from the trans community, from the community that was the other for all this. That's an interesting point. There's another one. This was a couple of them. I feel maybe I read the same comic twice, or maybe you revisited this at one point because you do that from time to time. There was a question that I always asked when I started the show back in 2015 myself. I asked a lot of trans people, how do you feel about people being stealth versus being out? And if somebody is stealth, do they owe it to the community? And I stopped asking the question because I always got the same answer. Everybody should do what they feel comfortable doing. Everybody should live their life and nobody should be judging anybody else. But you did a strip where you talk about how even before you transitioned and early in transition, you would seek out people and you would wonder, is that person trans? Or you would actually spot somebody who you were pretty sure was trans for one reason or another. And the first time that I think there was like the first strip, it was, we cannot acknowledge each other. That is the worst thing in the world for multiple reasons. I mean, one, it sends the message to the person, oh yeah, I got you, I spotted you, you don't pass, you don't, there's all of those feelings. And then also, of course, the obvious one, the far more sledgehammery one, which is one of personal safety, which again, you talk about as well in the strip. And then later, there was a comic where you were going through those same thoughts and essentially said, you know what, screw it. Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'd never meet anybody like me. And blah, blah, and he basically did that. And I'm curious a little bit about that because that's a very touchy subject. There's a lot of ways to look at that and a lot of strong feelings on all sides of something like that.
Oh yeah. Okay, so in that first year transition, I mean, I was making a lot of these comics that were related to my trans experiences, but I was mostly living stealth. I was very privileged in the way that I got read as cis almost immediately. For my first year of transition, I didn't get misgendered, and I don't get misgendered to this day. I actually do remember the last time I got misgendered, and it was in 2015. Like, I mean, to my face by a person who looked at me, sort of thing, you know?
Right.
So I'm very privileged in that way. I could have gone stealth if I'd wanted to, I'm sure. But living that life to the degree that I did, it was so lonely. And it was just like you're living your life in this way that is on cis people's terms to some degree. You're
Yeah.
never working through these feelings of shame or one's own worth, or even just like if the world were to know everything about me, it would still love me, sort of thing. Like I know it's not the case that everybody has to love every person, or I know I'm not ever going to be accepted by large portions of the world, and I'm okay with that. But as long as I'm, like, say, living stealth and trying to hide it from everybody, I still am not okay with myself to some
Right.
degree. And I've never met a person that either lived stealth or had lived stealth for a long period of time who didn't have a lot of internalized transphobia, who didn't have a lot of feelings of guilt or shame or anything like that. And
Yeah.
often they have ideas about sex and gender that aren't helpful. And I'm not going to judge anybody per se, but I don't think it's good for you to live stealth. I think it's forcing you to live life not on your own terms.
Right.
And I also don't think a person can ever fully love you unless they know you. the real you, the core of your experience. And I don't think a person can ever know me if they don't know I'm transgender and all the things I've lived through related to that. You don't know me if you
Right.
don't know I'm transgender. And if I come out to a person, and nowadays my policy is I will out myself if there's another out trans person in the situation, or if trans issues are brought up within the situation. If it was like a screaming, yelling bigot who seemed like they're going to be dangerous, I might not necessarily.
Right. Well, let's be anyone who's listening to this and thinking they're being judged. Let's put aside all concerns of personal safety. That is a completely different animal. Nobody is suggesting you should be putting yourself at risk or anything like that. I mean, that's the world we live in. We all acknowledge that. So
if you have to be stealth.
This is outside of all that.
Do you that you got to do what you got to do to survive?
Right.
I might say, well, who knows what life situation you're in, but maybe you shouldn't live in a place where people are that dangerous to you or associate with these types of people.
Well, not everybody has that choice, though.
To figure that out, though. Like, I'm not gonna, maybe you can't move for whatever reason. There's lots of reasons why people can't. Lots of reasons why somebody would have to go stealth. I still don't think it's great for you.
Yeah, in a mental health sense, no. I think that's a fair point.
If you're surrounded by constant danger that you have to hide from, it's probably going to be very hard on you.
And it all comes from the 1970s era standards of care, where in order to be trans and in order to get the surgery, and I'm putting air quotes up, guys, for anybody who's not seeing that, big air quotes, you essentially had to agree to these conditions where you could never acknowledge that you were trans, and you move across the country and you put your life behind and nobody can ever know. And this was medicine at the time, and that cannot be healthy. Secrets and whatnot are not healthy burdens to carry throughout your entire life. I mean, and yet I've talked to people who went through it, and they said, oh, they would drill you in like how to deal when somebody asks you something, or when something comes up, like, why don't you have a high school yearbook, or who did you go to prom with, or things of that nature. Like they would, and I'm like, oh my God, you'd have to rehearse and remember all that stuff. And that can't be good. That can't be healthy to put that on somebody. But then on the flip side, again, what world did that grow out of? And then you get back to the issue of personal safety, which it's just horrific that we're still discussing issues of personal safety for trans people in 2021.
And straight up, I want to say every single person who is trans automatically gets my respect to some degree, because that's a hard life to live. And any trans person who comes out and transitions to whatever that means for them, you get my respect. But it's, to even more say, I don't want to make it a hierarchy, but if you came out of transition back in the fucking Stone Age, back with the 70s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, whoa, you were playing on hard mode. I like major hats off to you. Like, that's incredible. You had to jump through so many hoops and deal with so much crap. Automatically, you're going to be getting my respect there for sure. And it's just unfortunate, though, that came with so much difficulty and honestly negative ways of thinking about ourselves that do not serve the trans community. They were created by cis people for cis people.
Right.
And for us to internalize that, I think it's harmful to the trans psyche. And that goes back to this idea of living stealth, having to hide this part of who you are. If you're forced to do that by the world is not serving you. And you deserve better. You shouldn't have to do that in order to live your life. I don't want to say, I guess, the old use of the term unmolested. People, people bothering you over it. Like, you should be able to just be out and be yourself and talk about your life freely in a way that isn't judged, and then be integrated in your whole life. Because otherwise, you're going to be cut off from a piece of who you are and your experience. And that's, speaking from experience, it's not a great feeling.
Right. So shifting gears a little bit, just want to ask you finish up on some of the other comics. So you mentioned Starfist Gemini a couple of times, and you said that you've sort of gone away from that and may come back to it at some point, but tell us a little bit about Starfist Gemini, not Starfish. I almost said Starfish several times.
Everybody does. I got a feeling that's part of why people slip around on that. Like that was a comic. I started doing it because I wanted to do something a little more ongoing. Like I said, when I first started doing comics, it was more like I wanted to do graphic novels rather than one-off comic strips. So I wanted to do something that was a little more in line with that. And I love martial arts. I love dinosaurs. I like sci-fi, Mad Max, post-apocalyptic stuff, muscular ladies. And just like I took all the stuff that I like and I put it into a story. And it was kind of the sense of like, you know what? I've got a feeling that if I was just to put all the things I'm passionate about into something it'll find some sort of audience somewhere.
Right.
And, it did find a small degree of an audience, but nowhere near as much as my other work. And that was frustrating to some degree. And it was also this sense of like, I've got to keep paying my bills and surviving. And this thing that is very time consuming to make, drawing a beautifully, lovingly crafted comic that I'm pouring my heart and soul into, that's not actually helping me survive right now. And I almost feel like I keep getting my feelings hurt because I work my butt off for this thing. Actually, somebody literally, I keep telling this story. I feel bad. The person that said it, I know they didn't mean harm, but I was promoting Starfist at a convention, and someone came up to me and was talking about my work and how much they loved it. And I was like, oh, well, I'm promoting my new book, this, Starfist Gemini. And they were like, oh yeah, but your other work's better. And it was like, okay.
The work that takes a lot less time and
Yes, it isn't my heart,
wow.
my fucking heart on a plate here for you. Like, okay, it's all the stuff that I love most in the world. Okay, cool. But I realized though, with that story, like I mentioned earlier, I was kind of hiding from a lot of feelings within it. I think I was almost like I wanted to experience not a power fantasy, not a fighting things story, and that's I did moving into horror.
I want to talk about horror, but there's one I want to talk. I want to cover before that, which is dinosaur related again. We keep going back to dinosaurs. Oh, you're gonna have to refresh my. I'm completely. I didn't write down the title, but it is essentially. It looks like the last dinosaur on Earth.
Oh yeah.
After
no other. Yeah.
No other. Oh my God! Like, and this almost goes into horror a little bit. I mean, this is a post-apocalyptic. Is this supposed to be like? This is essentially, guys. This is like there's this one dinosaur who's foraging around, and there you get kind of its internal monologue, but it's a dinosaur, so there's no words. It's just sort of like, ooh, food. Oh, enemy. Oh, run. Stuff like that. But oh my God, there's some complex stuff going on here in that very simple palette.
No other was very close to my heart. It was my first attempt. I think I started doing it like 2016 for sure. I sent off little samples of it to publishers. Got no bites. It's understandable. But it was, like this. It was meant to be like The Road, but with dinosaurs. It was like it's after the asteroid fell or whatever. And this Troodon, I believe it was, small theropod dinosaur is foraging the wasteland, trying to find both means of survival as well as reunite with his lost family. And it was a very sad story. And I finished the script. It was going to be about 100 pages or so, 120 pages. And that was another case of like, this thing takes a lot of work. It's not getting a huge audience. Unfortunately, I have to put it on the back burner at the very least. I've got like a long history. And if you talk to any creator, especially comics, I think they're going to have a long history of comics. Like, I tried that, wasn't landing super well, and I got other things I need to be doing. Maybe I'll come back to it.
You've taken some steps into horror comics with trauma as a pretty strong theme there. And you've got the two, She Never Came Out, and what was the second one?
The Urban Animal.
The Urban Animal. Yeah. Holy crap.
It's a bit of a left turn for me there.
Damn.
I think I'd had an idea for She Never Came Out for some years of, I was really struck by imagery of just people who go into a door and just don't come out. It's a room, it's a dead end, but somebody just didn't leave. And I had a lot of nightmares and night terrors when I was a very small child, to the point where I was actually afraid to be alone in a room. I just didn't like the dark. I had to have a nightlight, and I could not be alone in even the side of the house. I needed to be like in the same side of the house as, say, my mom or somebody else. I just couldn't handle it. And eventually I learned how to handle those nightmares. And I think that relates more to The Urban Animal than She Never Came Out. But there's a sense of just being scared when there isn't necessarily anything wrong. And it was also having to do with like this loss of my North Star that I was talking about with the loss of martial arts. This in the comic, this woman, her wife, disappears into their bedroom door, and nobody believes her that that's where she went. They think she must have just run off or something. And she knows what happened to some degree, in the sense of, well, I know she went in that door and didn't come out. And it's kind of her being afraid to confront her own stuff, which I think I definitely spent most of my life being too afraid to confront my gender or sexuality or anything like that, and just feeling kind of completely unempowered to some degree because of that.
Mhm.
And so she's just stuck in her apartment, not going into that bedroom and sleeping on the couch and just descending into nothing because she doesn't have anything anymore and she has no means to move forward. And eventually she has to confront this thing and she goes into that bedroom
Yes.
and
And oh my
I'll
God,
just go from there.
yeah, no, there was a lot wrong. Oh my God,
Yeah.
there was a lot wrong. And then you have the sequel, Urban Animal, where they're dealing with the fact, and I'm not accusing you of ripping you off. In fact, I'm saying it's going the other way. I think the recent Marvel stuff with WandaVision and Falcon and the Soldier is ripping you off because,
Oh.
well, for those who have, it's like people are coming back after being snapped and being missing for 5 years, and that's something your characters are struggling with, where they were missing for several months. And yet there's no record of where they went. There was no person that kid. And so they're trying to get on with their life without anybody really believing what happened to them.
Yeah.
You know,
And
so
that's very much like the experience, I think, of coming out and say the world not trusting you. You're not a real woman. You're up to something nefarious. And the bad things that happen to you in your life are your fault. And actually, it was you doing something bad kind of sense. And it's tied like, I live in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is like the roughest neighborhood in Canada to some degree.
The roughest. See, now I live in Detroit. So when you say the roughest neighborhood in Canada,
it's okay. It's a funny thing. So people think, oh, Canada's so tame and so good. Everything's good in Canada. We got some places that we dump our people. This is, I don't mean this in a derogatory term, but this is Canada's garbage can. It to some degree. This is our garbage dump. We're like massive addictions crisis, opioid crisis here, sirens constantly going off, people just living in the most horrendous poverty. It's a really hard up neighborhood that gets a lot of crap. And also there's condos going up and there's gentrification happening. I see the ways the neighborhood is like, they're just trying to push these people out. We had the Olympics in 2010. They just bust a bunch of people out of the downtown east side to clean up the town. They've been just trying to push people out for years and years. And I see the effects, and I see the effect on myself living down here too. Like it's hard on a person to live in a place surrounded by like misery and like all of the you see the nasty side of society. I've been struck by the imagery I see all the time down here of billboards, and there's just billboards by the road because there's major arteries, and you'd never have that in a nice rich neighborhood, but you have it down here where we'll just put up a billboard, sell the billboard space, right? And you can see this smiling face of some billboard and the beautiful mountains maybe in some condos, and then you can turn and see the other view of it, and you see the back of the billboard and it's just this nasty rusted metal frame, and then you can see there's condos looming above, but there's also the tent city down the street that's growing every day of hundreds of people having to live in a park. Like it's this two-faced society, and then they come around and tell us people that struggle with things that we're the wrong ones, we're bad, clearly the bad things that happen to us are our fault. So it's going into the sense of empowerment and personal responsibility versus vulnerability and relying on others and feeling alienated from society and not invested in a world that it feels like it kind of betrayed you. And honestly, that was probably the most personal comic I've ever done. And that's actually why I'm not doing it right now, because the purpose of it was to dig up all my stuff. I'm looking at society, but I'm also looking at myself and my negative, toxic attitudes that I know I've been carrying around and trying to exorcise those demons, so to speak. And I think it kind of did it. I haven't talked about this publicly. I've been meaning to kind of talk about it a little more, but like, I feel like working on the first chapter of Urban Animal kind of helped me get a lot of these things out. I was doing the script, I've scripted the rest of it and doing storyboarding for the rest of it. But I just sort of like, it was just bogging me down to be in the depths of like all my worst aspects and all of society's worst aspects, and just kind of like feeling sad and realizing what these characters need to do at a certain point is they're faced with this kind of unspeakable evil, this overwhelming horror that you can really to some degree do nothing about. What else can you do but to some degree walk away? You're going to fight the whole world, you're going to fix all the evil in the world? You can't. So I kind of had to do that too, where I kind of took a step back from that project, and I'm going to finish it probably later this year. But I just needed to be doing something that made me happy. And that's where this martial arts stuff that I've been doing a lot lately has been coming in. I need, in order to move on from the muck of myself in my life, I need to experience happiness. And in doing so, then I can have these characters experience happiness too at the end of the story. So personal journeys through art seems to be a running theme with me. And I think I'm okay with that.
And then finishing up, tell us about the new book.
Oh, coming out again. So that's the sequel of my other graphic novel I did, First Year Out, which was about a trans girl's first year out. And I changed a lot in the course of writing First Year Out, and to the point where I knew if I wrote a second year out, it would be a pretty different book. And when I was kind of figuring out, like, I thought, I should put out another book. I hit up my publisher and said, hey, do you guys be interested in a First Year Out sequel? I've got a few ideas. And they said yes. And I was sort of thinking, well, I don't want to just make it like a second year out. Like, oh, it's about this trans girl out. And the first book was kind of very much geared towards my perspective of like a white, middle-class, able-bodied trans woman. That's a very particular kind of mainstream point of view. And I wanted to expand it because like the queer community is huge. There's so many facets to us. There's all this diversity and wonderful variety of human experience. And it intersects with these things like class, race, neurotypical status, if you're neurodivergent, mental health, these things that go into making a person who they are. So I tried to make a story that wasn't just focused on like me and people like my experience, but be able to at least explore the other aspects of experience and try to relate them and just try to be, I guess, talking about the whole integrated self and the way I've been talking about discovering my integrated self and becoming okay with my past and who I am and all the pieces of me. That book was also part of that journey. It was me trying to find my community and find my place within community and understand how I fit. And it's sort of 5 semi-connected stories of following characters. I think of it like a baton pass. The one character has their story and then they pass the baton to the next character who has a bit of a story, who passes the baton to the next character, and then they're all related and they all come together at the end. And it's just a nice, sweet, gentle kind of antithesis to She Never Came Out and Urban Animal. And I was into like witchy stuff, really. I still kind of am. But I was really into witchy stuff, doing the horror stuff and also writing this book. So I'd made a dark pact with unspeakable powers. And these books are actually mirror images of one another. Coming Out Again is the mirror of Urban Animal.
Okay.
Urban Animal is the shadow. Coming Out Again is the light, so to speak. And hopefully the shadow will have its own light at the end and find peace there. But I had this nice, sweet, gentle exploration of identity and the harsh cruelty of our unforgiving worlds in the other. So I don't know. I'm a woman of extremes. I'm your Angel and your D-mom. So I like being able to have this shift of nice, sweet, gentle exploration and harsh, angsty exploration.
And where can people find it?
Coming Out Again is available on Amazon right now, as well as anywhere books are sold. Your local bookstore should be able to carry it if you request it, if they're not already carrying it. You can also buy signed copies directly from me on my Etsy shop, etsy.com/ca/life of Bria art. You can get a copy from me and I'll not just sign it, but do a little drawing. I'm going to actually personalize them on live stream, doing lots of live stream shows right now. And I was doing some book giveaways. I'm going to return to book giveaways once I've got hard copies in my possession, but COVID's actually slowed down shipping on those. So I figured, well, I'll wait till I've got the copies and I'll do some more giveaways. But if you get a copy from me, it can get signed and personalized on stream. You could watch me do it. You could even tell me what you want and I'll draw it on stream. So,
and then the comic strip is lifeofbriacomics.com.
Yep. That's my site.
All righty. Please give me a shout out when you live stream when you're doing mine, because you owe me a book.
Absolutely, for sure. Come watch, talk to me about it, and then we'll figure out what you get.
Awesome. Bria, thanks so much for coming on. Give me some of your time. Really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. This was an absolute pleasure.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to Bria for coming on the program. Had a wonderful time talking with her. If you'd like to see more of her work, you can find her comic at lifeofbria.com, and her graphic novels First Year Out, A Transition Story, and Coming Out Again, Transition Stories, are both available on Amazon. If you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard here tonight or suggestions for future shows, guests, or topics, please feel free to email me at niceguy9418@usa.com. Leave a comment on my blog at eddiecabot.blogspot.com, or you can find my YouTube channel, Nice Guy Eddie. Also, you can friend me on Facebook at Eddie Cabot and follow me on Twitter at Nice Guy Eddie Cab. Please enjoy the rest of your evening and keep it tuned to Rainbow Radio.